Hi, I am Chris Reeve, and I am with Reeve Autism Consulting, and I also run the blog and the podcast Autism Classroom Resources. And I am a behavior analyst, and my background's in psychology, but I have spent the last more years than I like to count, more than 20, we'll say, working in special education and general education classrooms with teachers alongside teachers. And so what I want to share with you today is how a system that we've developed over time for setting up the classroom so that we can integrate evidence-based practice into that classroom and make sure that we can do it. So I'm going to focus on establishing the classroom, but we're also going to talk about setting up the instructional programs and things like that to make sure that we've got the elements that we need in place in order to make it work. So this is a model, and I'm not going to read all of it, but the main point that I want you to get from this model is that that triangle in the middle, the yellow, is our classroom structure. All of the things on the outside in the rectangles are the strategies that we use to support them. And the strategies that we want to implement in our classroom, they rest upon the structure of the classroom. So if we don't have a strong structured classroom, the ability to implement any of our evidence-based practices becomes much harder because they really kind of collapse into chaos. They collapse upon each other. So the classroom structure includes the things I'm going to talk about today, which include the teaching implementation plan, the class schedule, the Zooming plan, and the physical environment. But it also includes things like selecting your curriculum, developing your IEPs, behavior support, and things like that. So I'll touch on those things, but I'm primarily going to focus on structuring the classroom itself so that we can actually begin to implement the evidence-based practices. When we think about a classroom model, we are looking for an efficiently structured learning environment. We want the classroom to run itself as much as it possibly can. And the reason for that is because we don't have a lot of time, if we're interacting with the students, to spend directing other people in the classroom or worrying about everything else that's going on. So the more that things run with systems, the easier it is for the classroom to run smoothly. And we are trying to integrate what we know about effective educational and behavioral strategies into the context of our classroom. So we have to start with our individualized programs. Your classroom is going to look different depending on who is in your classroom. So if you have a student who has, if you have a lot of students who need a lot of very small group intensive instruction on staying in their seat, following directions, you're going to have a lot of small group intensive instruction in your schedule. But if you have a classroom of students who are able to do those learning readiness skills, but are working on learning in a larger group, who are working on staying for longer periods of time in a group and learning with other students around them, then you're going to have larger groups as part of your classroom. But we really want to focus in on making sure that we know all the different questions, like what are we going to teach, how are we going to teach it, where, who, and what strategies we're going to use. So these are the elements that I'm going to focus on throughout the day. These are the elements of a structured learning environment that we really want to do. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is there are a lot of different evidence-based strategies out there that come from a variety of ideologies, from behavior analysis to education to psychology and things like that. The one thing that I think all of our autism research really shows us, and we actually have highly leveraged practices from the Center for Exceptional Children now, all cite the need for high levels of engagement. Our goal has got to be engaging our students in instruction for the whole time that we have them, every minute of the day. Everything is a learning opportunity, but we need to plan for that. So that high level of engagement is a really critical element. And it's one of the reasons why you need a well-organized classroom that runs on systems, that has strategies in place that reduce how much direction the teacher has to provide during the day. Because if I'm giving direction to adults in the classroom, I'm not engaging students. And so we have to make sure that we are organizing our classroom well so that we can get a high level of engagement for our students. We have to make sure that our physical environment is highly organized, because we want our students to have predictability and know where they need to go, but also because our staff needs to know what takes place in different places so they can direct the students to the right place. So all of that is really important in organizing our physical environment. We have to have clear environmental cues. Our students have to know exactly what to expect when they come into the classroom, when they go into an area. What are they expected to do? Those environmental cues do not have to be fancy, as you can see here, but they do have to be clear, and they have to be presented in a way that the students will understand. So if your students are not readers or their reading comprehension is problematic, we're going to need to add pictures to that. We need routine and predictability. And I think when I'm recording this, and I know that you may be listening to this at a different time, but when I'm recording this, we're looking at going back to school after the coronavirus pandemics kept us out for a few months at the end of the year. And so consequently, a lot of our students are going to be pretty stressed coming back to school. Many of our learners with autism struggle with anxiety and difficulty with change as it is. And because of that, we really need to make sure that we have routine and predictability in place for them. One way that we do that is through visual schedules, and I'll talk about them a little bit later, but really making sure that we've got a set routine down so that, again, the less I have to spend worrying about where I'm going to go next, the more time I have to focus on the learning that you're presenting to me right now. And that's a really key component. Implementation of appropriate curriculum tied to our state standards. Now, we know that we have a requirement to tie our learning back to our Florida state standards in this case, but we need to make sure that we also have appropriate curriculum in place for our students. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I'm talking about teaching implementation plans. We need to identify assessment and intervention strategies that are linked to specific IEP and curricular goals. In other words, we need to know what we're going to teach our students. We need to know how we're going to teach those students, and we need to know how we're going to evaluate what they have learned and whether or not it's working. And that's really what the teaching implementation plan is all about, which is the first component in this system that I'll talk about. We also need to make sure that we have individualized instruction. I talked about the fact that your classroom is going to look different depending on which students you have in it. So from one year to the next, your classroom may not be exactly the same. But we also need to make sure that we're individualizing within that classroom the instruction that our students need. That does not mean that they need one-to-one throughout the day. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of our kids need one-to-one at all during the day. And in fact, for some of our students, our goal may be to get them to learn in a larger environment. But it does mean that the goals that we present in those larger environments, whether it's general ed or special ed, need to focus on their individual needs. And the biggest crux, I think, of all educational programming, but particularly for students in special ed and students with autism, is that we have to know the student. We have to know what they need. And I really like this quote that children are our priority. We have got to keep that at the center of everything we do. We design the classroom around the students in the classroom. This sometimes involves change. Things change. We certainly had a lot of change in the time that I'm recording this. Collaboration is the strategy that we can use to bridge that. So we always want to make sure when we're working with families, when we're working with other professionals in our building, we're focused on the needs of the student. We make our decisions in our classroom based on what our students need. And that's a really key component. So this is really the cycle of instruction, and I'm not going to cover everything in it, but at the top you see that it starts with strong goals. We have to have good goals and objectives to be able to really teach and individualize. And that includes our IEP and our curriculum, because we have both of them are part of our instruction. We use the teaching implementation plan, which I'll show you, to scope that out and kind of make that individualized plan. We individualize our instruction by building our schedule for the classroom. We set up an organized space, and we organize our staff. Once we have the right half of the circle done, we can continue around the left side, because now we can really implement and evaluate our instruction and troubleshoot. So I'm going to talk about the right side of the circle today, but all of it is obviously important in providing evidence-based practices. So the teaching implementation plan, which I do sometimes refer to as the teaching intervention plan, not to be confusing, I just keep renaming it, is really a way of mapping out the student's individualized educational plan, so their IEP, into a blueprint of how we're going to implement it. Because if you think about it, an IEP is really a legal document that says this is what the student's going to learn. It doesn't tell us how he's going to learn it, where he's going to learn it, what types of strategies we need to use. So that's what the teaching implementation plan is really all about. It is how we make decisions about classroom setup based upon the knowledge of the students that that classroom serves. I do a tip for every student in a classroom, because by the time I'm done, I'm well versed in their IEP and their needs and their goals. It becomes a really good way to make sure that I have the student's IEP goals directly connected to an instructional strategy and a data collection strategy, and to an instructional time during the day. And then I know what kind of activities need to go into my schedule. This is what I use to make decisions as a team about the class. It also allows me to review resources that are needed or available. So what student staff ratios do I need to concern about? Do I have a student who needs a unique or one-to-one aid? Do I have a student who has inclusion needs that's going to require staff support in the general ed class? Do we have challenging behaviors that we need to be concerned about and be able to support? So it allows us to look at our resources and the needs of our students and when we make that plan. And then it also allows us to outline the need for administrative support for things like a crisis plan or for scheduling. It becomes something that we can also use to say, this is the needs of my class based on their teaching plans. And it's really a pretty simple document. You can do it as a document, and I'll make sure that you have access to a copy of this. I've got some links throughout the presentation that will send you to some places on the web where you can download some things. You can do it on the form. You can also do it, I've done it on IEP at a glance. So with Easy IEP, we used to print out an IEP at a glance and then write the next things to the right next to those goals. Here you see an example that you can see the goals and objectives that came from the IEP. The blue is a goal. In this case, the objectives make up the goal. So I didn't bother to do the goal itself, because if we master all the objectives in this case, we've mastered the goal. Our primary teaching activity, where we can practice the skill, how we're going to teach it, how we're going to evaluate, and then what notes I need for myself in terms of what materials are needed or what other steps are needed. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So why use it? One is it does allow us to review the IEP. It makes sure that everybody on the team really understands the IEP and the needs of the students. It makes us really think through our instruction. I will sometimes write IEP goals on my tip, because once I've written my IEP goal, I already know how am I going to teach it, what kinds of activities would work to teach this skill, how can this be implemented, and how am I going to assess it. And if I think about those strategies ahead of time, my IEP goals will be stronger. But it really helps us think through our instruction and lay it out. Now, it is very much what you see a good experienced teacher doing in their head. They're taking their IEP and translating it in their head. It's also making sure that we have a data collection system that is tied to every single goal and objective, so that we don't get to progress reports and then think, oh, I haven't been measuring that. So it makes sure that when we're setting up our data systems, we've got all the goals accounted for. It helps you to organize your schedule, because as I've said, it helps you know what kinds of activities you need to have to support the goals of your students. The reason that this is important, even though it is what all good teachers do in their head, is because we don't always realize as teachers that we have to communicate this information with staff. It's not in their head. It's in our head. We know that this is what needs to be done, but this is a team effort in a special ed classroom. It's even a team effort in a general ed classroom with special needs students in it. So we need to make sure that we're communicating clearly to the staff what it is that we're doing. And if you think about it, our paraprofessionals in our classroom must know what they need to be working on with the student. They must be familiar with the IEP. But if you hand someone an IEP, it's a lot of legal jargon. And it's a lot of not wasted information, but it's a lot of information that doesn't go into actually using the IEP in the classroom. Giving them the tip allows them to know the goals and objectives, but really see where they're going to be taught. So that allows them at art to know, I don't put his name on his paper because the teacher wants him to practice that skill by doing that himself, because that's one of his IEP goals. And it's also a way to communicate with families, because for our families, it's really difficult for them to see, how do I go from this list of goals you're going to teach to having trust that you're actually able to implement that through the day? How do I know that this strategy that you're using in the classroom relates back to his IEP? Why are you doing independent work? He can already do that. Well, I'm doing it because we have goals for him to work independently on his own. So it helps them see why you do the things you do. And this is just kind of my little soapbox moment. I know that a lot of teachers, and you may have heard other people say this, a lot of teachers feel like, well, I want to get to know the students for who they are. And I don't want to be prejudiced by reading last year's teacher's assessment from the IEP. You can't plan a program. We are expected to educate our students from the moment they walk in the door. We can't have a program ready for them on day one if we don't know what their needs are and what their goals are. So we have to get to know our students before they come into the classroom so that we can serve them well. Otherwise, we're going to be playing catch up for the rest of the year. And we're going to erode our trust with the family who brought us their child and said, educate them. And we have to actually be ready to do that from day one. So the first step in the tip is just a simple cover sheet. And I include this here because I think it's useful just to have some basic information available. I put this in a program notebook that goes in the classroom. Anybody coming in can easily scan what is needed, what they need to know. So it's a good document for substitutes and new related service providers, as well as the rest of the staff for the classroom. So it's just getting at some of that. The other thing that it includes are things like the current reading curriculum that you're using and where you left off, so that if you know that from last year, you can pick up for this year. But so many times I see students come into a classroom and maybe we know that they're using the Reading Milestones curriculum, but we don't know what level they were on or what lesson they left off on. And so we have to figure that out. And sometimes that means we're repeating things that they don't need to repeat or starting too far ahead of where they left off. So knowing that information becomes useful. It also has a place where I can list what staff training we need to do with our students so that we can plan for that over time. Step 2 is writing in your goals and objectives. Now, we can do a whole day just on writing goals and objectives, so I won't spend a lot of time on that because that's a different training. But effective individualized classrooms are going to be based on the curriculum and the IEP. So you're going to need to have both of those. That is what makes up our lessons. But the ability to design our classroom effectively to meet the individualized needs of our students are going to depend on the strength of the IEP goals. Strong IEP goals make it much easier to plan a classroom than IEP goals that are vague and we're not sure what they're really focused on. So you need to look at your IEP goals at the beginning of the year, and if you're not sure, seek out more information. And there may be times when we have to revisit them and call an interim to make changes. Step 3 is really looking at where and when are we going to teach this skill. So it's our time and our map. What is the time of day where the student can get the most opportunities to practice this skill? Most students with autism, even our extremely bright students with autism, need repetition to learn certain things. They may pick up some things like that, but other skills like social skills and things like that, they need more repetition. So because of that, we need to really think about, where can I get that repetition? Because just being presented with it once is not going to do it. If I'm working on communication skills, I need to make multiple requests. It's not enough to just do it once. So I need a primary teaching activity where I can get those multiple opportunities. I generally go for at least 5. Some things are going to lend themselves to that. Some things won't. I can request things 5 times, but maybe I'm learning to ask for a break, and that opportunity only presents itself 1 or 2 times during an activity. So then I need to put it in multiple activities to get that level of repetition. So your primary teaching activity are going to be things like reading, math, science, direct instruction. If you are doing some kind of distance learning or you are teaching online, then it may be things like your one-to-one Zoom time or an independent work system that they're doing at home. So there's lots of variability to this, but the things that go on your schedule are going to be some of your primary teaching activities. So, any kind of activity that you would put into your schedule is going to be where you would do that if the teaching strategy can be implemented in that. So for instance, if I'm running morning meeting and the student needs to learn this skill using a discrete trial with really one-to-one monitoring, that's going to be very hard to do in a group activity. So that probably wouldn't be my primary teaching activity. Our next step is looking at, it's not enough to learn it in one activity. When is it going to use this skill? Our students with autism they're going to be the same kinds of activities, but our students with autism are not set it and forget it kind of kids. They're not kids that we teach something and they have it forever. If we don't address their ability to maintain the skills and generalize it to new people, new materials, new situations, new instructions, they're not going to be able to use that skill in a way that is going to be meaningful for them. So we really want to make sure that we are programming our day to include times of the day where maybe we're not getting those multiple repetitions, but they're still practicing that skill. Step 5, and I'm going to show you how this all goes together. Step 5 is the how. How are we going to teach this skill? We've talked about the when and the where, and we've talked about the what. Now we're going to talk about the how. The how might be a curriculum that you're using. So it might be Edmark or the Stevens reading program or Wilson program. It might be Touch Money or Touch Math. It might be Handwriting Without Tears. It might be a larger curriculum like a unique learning system lesson specifically. It might be a STAR lesson, a strategies for teaching based on autism research, or it may be something more specific like discrete trials or backward chaining or shaping. Yes, I'm a behavior analyst. I use those things. It might be the picture exchange communication system, which goes beyond just having pictures to an actual step-by-step strategy to teach it. These are the way that you're going to present the skill, support the skill, and fade your support for that skill. So for some of the things, it might be, I'm going to present him with that opportunity. I'm going to use a visual to cue him, and then I'm going to prompt him, fade out my prompts, and reinforce his success. That's the good practice of instruction throughout, but there might be an easier way to explain it. So it might be an intervention like pivotal response training, shaping, picture exchange. It might be a program like the unique, like a reading curriculum. It might be a strategy. So especially if you still have students who are learning at home or you're teaching in a distance program, it might be a scavenger hunt where we built into a fun activity at home some language activities where we've taught the family to elicit, give me the one that you would cook with, give me the one that goes on the stove, give me the one that goes in the refrigerator, so that you're building some functional language around an activity. So it might be integrating it into a home routine. We're going to do laundry now. Here's your task analysis. We're going to cook dinner now. Here's your task analysis. So it might be a strategy like that as well. It might be looking at data collection. So our next step is looking at data collection. So our data collection is going to tell us how we're going to collect data on a consistent basis, as well as how we're going to analyze that data. So we need to make sure that we have a way for every single goal and objective to assess if the student's making progress and troubleshoot if they're not. Now, that may be something like a discrete trial data sheet. It might be a group data sheet where we present the whole group, where we have the whole group on a data sheet and we're taking individual data on a weekly basis. It might be an ABC data sheet if we're doing an FBA for behavior. It might be the student self-monitors and takes his own data. It can also be work product that the student does, or permanent product where we're putting down what kind of support we gave him on that work product, or it might be a test. If we can use work products and tests, use that because it's the easiest thing to do. There are tons of ways to take data, and in a 2-hour webinar about setting up classrooms, I can't share everything about that, but it is really important that we know how we're going to collect data and that that data collection is manageable. I would do my data collection in my primary instructional time. So I want to make sure the primary time that I choose on my tip for teaching the skill is also going to accommodate data collection. And keep in mind that data collection needs to be done by the teacher, but it can also and should also be done by other members of the classroom team. So these are just some examples. For math, sometimes we're talking about accuracy. For social skills, we might be talking about he will do something 3 times within a 15-minute period. And this is where the way we write our goals lends itself to how we take our data as well. So here's an example of a tip. This is just one goal from the tip. His goal is that he will read environmental print across the school environment with 80% accuracy. So in this case, Hugh will follow, his first objective is that Hugh will follow a visual schedule to complete a multi-step task independently. An independent work time, I use an independent work system that comes from Project Teach. There is a specific way that you teach it. There is a specific way it is set up. The goal of independent work time is to practice skills that have already been mastered, because if you haven't mastered the skill, you can't do it independently, but also making sure that you are following the steps and learning to work for more and more time on your own, because that's a critical skill on a job. It's a critical skill in a general ed classroom, and we're always teaching to that next environment. We're always trying to build independence. So the one skill that I can teach with an independent work system, rather than just maintain skills, is I can teach independence. It actually provides prompting, provides visual supports, and fades prompting out. So that would be something I can use an independent work system for. I can also use schedules in a vocational setting for this student because he's a high school student. A direct instruction time, a cooking time, an art time, those are other times that I might use a visual schedule that the student practice. But I'm going to take my data in independent work. I'm going to take independent work data sheet weekly. I'm going to use my independent work system as my how, my strategy I'm going to teach. And I can remind people in my notes that we can use the schedule to visually cue him to talk about what he's doing as well as to complete the task. And you see below a picture of the work system itself and the way it's visually structured. So that may look familiar if you have experience with them. And then I have a data sheet that I use for independent work that we take once a week that looks at how many steps can he complete independently. And this is just the independent work system and a self-graphing data sheet where you can see the steps on the left. This is another example. This is a preschooler. And if we look at goal 2, Alfred will initiate communication with a partner on 4 out of 5 opportunities by touching the partner with objects. So he's actually using objects and pictures. We get lots of opportunities for him to do this during snack because food is a highly preferred item. So he's likely to initiate that communication. He is working in his objectives on gaining the attention of a communicative partner and giving them that item, that object. We also though know that snack isn't going to be enough repetition because this is a student who needs a ton of repetition to get this skill. So we're also going to work on it with some highly preferred items in direct instruction. That's where I'm going to take my data. That's where I'm going to get the most opportunities. but he can work on communication during lunch. I'm just not going to make him do it as much because I want him to eat at some point during the day. He can work on making those requests for items during play, but I'm not going to target my data collection and my lots of opportunities during those times. But that's when he can generalize those skills. We're going to use the picture exchange communication system, which is a specific system that's laid out in 6 phases to teach initiation and use of communication visuals to request. This student isn't using visuals yet, he's using objects. He really needs 3-dimensional objects because representative pictures aren't being effective for him. And we have a PECS data sheet that we take data on how many times he is making those requests and what level of independence. So I'm taking that data during snack and direct instruction, and I have staff during those times to do that. I don't necessarily have the staff to do that data as much during lunch and play. So it allows me to really map out where my data collection is going to be. So when you get all your tips done, you know exactly what kind of activities you need. You know exactly where your data collection is going to take place and what you're targeting in each of the activities of your day. This is just another example. By the end of the first 9 weeks on a community-based instruction work site, she will read an article from a magazine and answer comprehension questions. We have to make sure that somebody is with her on that community-based site at least weekly to do our weekly checklist that we have for data collection. So we've got our strong goals, we've got our tip. So now we have to think about how we're going to individualize our instruction by creating our schedule. So that's really our next component. We have to really structure our schedule. And I think it's important to recognize that our schedule is going to change, and that's okay. We're going to try something on the first day of school, and it may or may not work, and then we'll come back and change it. We're going to set it out, and you can see in the grid, those initials at the top of the form are the students' names. So I've got an individual schedule, but it's a class schedule. My goal in setting up a classroom is never to have 8 kids, 10 kids running individually in their own system. My goal is to have them really focused on working in small groups, working in large groups. They need to expand what they're able to do. Our goal is to make an individualized schedule for each student, but that meets in the context of the classroom. So we're running a classroom, not a bunch of individual schedules. We want to make sure we have clearly defined periods of the day from beginning to end. We want to make sure that we end on a positive note. We don't want our activities to take too long, and I'll talk about that. But we want to really make sure that everybody knows when we're here, this time to this time during the day, we're in this activity. And we want to make sure that using our tip, we are embedding our IEP and curriculum skills into the activities. I once worked with a teacher who did her entire schedule with the schedule activity was the student's IEP goal. So communicate, request, or initiate communication for desired items would be the name of the activity. And when I encountered her, my first question was, so every time you change the student's IEP, you have to change your schedule? She's like, yeah. I'm like, that would drive me crazy. In her defense, my way of doing it drove her crazy, but she got it. I said, what if we take that communication goal and we embed it into snack time and into an instructional time? What if we take that reading goal that our student had in high school that I just showed you, and we embed it in her community-based work site during her break time, because that's when she would be reading a magazine in her real life. So we want to make sure that we're embedding our IEP and curriculum skills into the activities of the day, because if our student moves out of a special ed setting and into a general ed setting, that's what we're expecting them to do. So there are certain things that we have to think about when we go to create that classroom schedule. The time allotted to the activities needs to be appropriate to the needs of the students. You may have some students that you have 5-minute morning meetings. Some classrooms may have 5-minute morning meetings. Some classrooms may have 30-minute morning meetings. Some classes may have a 15-minute morning meeting for most of the class, but one student only stays for 5 minutes. And that's okay too. So we may set it up so that the student is not necessarily doing everything with the full class. So if you have a very diverse class in their skills, don't limit yourself to having everybody doing the same thing for the same amount of time. But do make sure for that student who's only coming to that activity for 5 minutes, do make sure that they are doing something productive with the other 10 minutes, that you have them scheduled. They're not just wandering around the classroom with nothing to do. We want to make sure that we have opportunities for learning in small groups and learning in big groups. Because ultimately we always want to be working our students towards learning for the next environment. And we want to make sure that our students are getting what they need and learning to work in a bigger context. Students with autism really struggle with being able to learn in a group. A lot of times we have to teach that skill. And we want to make sure that for our students, particularly with autism, that they have opportunities for both academic skills and social skills instruction. So some of it's about academics, but remember that in our IEPs, we have a present level of performance of academic achievement and functional performance. We also have to be working on functional performance. One of the areas for our students needs to be social skills because it's a deficit for students with autism. Making the schedule is probably, I think, the hardest thing to do in your classroom setup. I truly wish that I could just say, Alexa, redo my schedule. You will make a schedule. You will try it, you will see what works, and you will change it. And you will see if it works, and you will change it. In the beginning of the year, we will change the schedule multiple times. That is not a signal of your failure. That is a signal of the process of figuring out who your kids are and what types of supports they need. You may have found that, wow, that day went really slowly and those activities were too long because they fell apart before they were finished. I need to make them shorter, which means I need to add more activities in. You may find that, wow, we transitioned way too much during the day. I need to lengthen my activities a little bit so that we have fewer transitions. So some of it is going to be trial and error, and you will wish that you could just ask Google or Alexa to redo it for you. I really wish that that was the case. The decisions that we need to make in developing our schedules are selecting our activities, allocating our time, grouping our students, sequencing our activities, and constructing our schedule. So then we put it all together. So I want to talk about these 5 steps a little bit more, because I truly believe that if you have a highly structured schedule, once you have your schedule working, the rest of it falls into place much more easily. Your activities are going to correspond to your primary and secondary activities on the tip. So again, all of this is a process. So when you do your schedule and realize I only have one kid who needs large group activities, I'm going to have to make changes maybe to my tip to fit my schedule. Or maybe I find other activities for him to do and he does it in another classroom. So we have to get a little creative sometimes with the diverse needs of our students. But we need to make sure that the activities that are on our tip are in our schedule, that they coordinate. They're also going to reflect our curriculum. So if you're working in an early childhood classroom or a preschool classroom, our activities are going to be much more developmental. We're going to be working on play skills. We're going to be working on pretend skills that we're probably not going to be working on when we're in elementary school, and we definitely are not going to be working on in middle and high school. Some of our classes will be much more academic. Now, when I say that we have an academic classroom, I'm not saying we don't have functional skills, because everybody needs functional skills. I'm also not saying that if we have a functional classroom that we're not working on functional academics. But maybe it's the difference between I'm counting bears in a younger classroom, I'm counting coins in an older classroom, or I'm counting socks, or I'm counting silverware. So I'm looking for the classroom to reflect the type of curriculum that we're working with. We need to make sure that our curriculum is both developmentally and chronologically appropriate. We want it to be appropriate to the developmental skills of our students. We're not teaching algebra to our students that are working in a kindergarten level. However, if our high school students are only working at a kindergarten level, we're also not singing kindergarten songs and doing kindergarten activities. we're working on those same skills, but with older materials, again, like counting silverware instead of counting bears. We want to include a variety of tasks. Your students need to practice the same skills over and over. That doesn't mean they need to do it with the same materials over and over, because they're going to get bored. So we need to make sure that we're providing them with a variety of ways to learn those tasks and a variety of materials. That's also critical, not just for engagement, but because our students really need to generalize their skills to different situations, different materials, different instructions. And we have to teach that way to promote that generalization. And that's a particular area of need specific to autism. We also want to make sure that our activities are engaging and interesting to our students. We do not want our students to be bored. Boredom will kill your engagement. Boredom will create problem behavior. And so we want our students to want to come to school. We want them to want to come to instruction. So there's some ways that we can do that. One is we need to make sure that we're teaching age-appropriate activities. So when I'm making my schedule, on my preschool schedule, I might have dramatic play, because we're working on dramatic play skills, because that is how our preschoolers interact with other students. That is how our preschoolers learn from other social interaction. But that's not how our high school students learn. So for them, I might be looking at a leisure time during their day rather than a playtime. They need to learn leisure skills. Our young students occupy their downtime, or their time where they're expected to occupy themselves, with play activities. Our high school students need to be doing that same thing. They also need to be taught how to fill in that time when no one is giving them direct instruction with leisure activities. If you talk to any group home, you will hear the staff say that the time between when they come home from work and the time that they do dinner and then have an evening routine is often the hardest time of day for behavior. And a lot of that is because our students don't know how to occupy their free time effectively. So we may have a leisure time. Now that leisure time may include books and magazines. For older students, like I read novels, maybe they're not novel readers. Maybe their reading isn't that way. Maybe they're looking at scrapbooks. Maybe they're looking at pictures of things that they've done with the group during the day. So you can have a lot of different kinds of activities. We want to make sure that they're age appropriate, but they're also meeting their developmental needs. We want to make sure we've got a balance of group activities and individual or small group activities, and that those activities reflect their needs and abilities. We want to make sure that our students have the opportunity to work independently, because being able to work independently is a critical skill. If you can't work independently and somebody has to be there to organize your time and your work all the time, you have many fewer opportunities in life than somebody who can work on their own. It also is not an enabler. It's not a door opener, because I can't learn from my environment independently if someone is always teaching me. So we want to make sure that we have time where our students learn to do a task from beginning to end without encouragement, without somebody being there to praise every second. That's where I see independent work systems coming in, but it's also the way that we have to teach everything we do. If I can't do something independently and somebody has to be with me, then I'm much more limited in my opportunities in life. And we also want to make sure that we have opportunities for social interaction. It's one of the reasons on most of my schedules, I have some kind of group activity that I might call morning meeting, I might call calendar, I might call morning check-ins. I can do a lot of different things with it. As students get older, that time is not going to look like a preschool circle time. I stopped calling it circle after preschool, because to me, that's a younger activity. But the principles are the same, that we're learning to wait our turn, to raise our hand to contribute. We're working on communication. We're building a lot of skills that way. And a lot of those skills are social and communication. The bottom picture is a picture of an independent work area where the students are learning I work on my own. When I am here, I know that I do my sets of tasks on my own. We then have to figure out how to allocate our time. So you have certain times of day that you can allocate to different activities. Your times on schedule may match up with your school or class time periods, but if you're a high school teacher and your school is on a block schedule and you have 4 blocks, you are not, if you're running a self-contained classroom for students who are functioning at a much lower developmental level, you're not going to have them do the same task for that entire block. That just isn't going to make sense. So you want to make sure that you are dividing that block. Now, if your administration is telling you that you need to divide, that your classroom needs to be doing reading for the entire reading block, you could do reading direct instruction, reading independent work, reading as a group. You can do different reading activities to teach those skills and still be doing reading during that block. You may need to line up your schedule if your students leave your classroom to go into general ed. So you may need to make sure that your activities end at the same time that the period of the class ends so that they're ready to transition to another class. That's perfectly fine, but it doesn't mean that you have to do the same activity for that whole time to make that happen. So it's really important at times that we don't just kind of fall into thinking inside the box. Think outside the box. Divide your time up into the lengths of time in which the students can work meaningfully and not lose attention. So your activities should only be as long as the students can tolerate them. If your activities are falling apart and students are getting up and wandering around before your activity is finished, then it's too long. So look at your schedule as you run through the first few weeks of school, and if your activities are falling apart, shorten them. On the other hand, if they're going really well, you might be able to make them a little bit longer, and you can adjust accordingly with the other activities of the day. It's also important, as I mentioned earlier, that students may not engage in activities for the same amount of time. Some students may come to group for 10 minutes, some kids may stay for 20 minutes. That's okay. Just make sure that you've scheduled the other 10 minutes for the students that aren't there for the full 20. So maybe some kids come to the group activity for 10 minutes and then they have a 10-minute independent work time or a 10-minute small group time learning with direct instruction. So we get more instructional time in there in a smaller group for them rather than being in the larger group and not being able to tolerate it. And our activities should always end with success. We want our students to be successful so they move to the next activity and we're not losing them. When the activity falls apart or they continue to not be successful, we're going to lose that engagement. And remember, that engagement is the element that we're really trying to maintain throughout the day. We want to make sure in allocating our time that our pace of our day moves quickly. You want to have a schedule where you look up and go, what do you mean it's lunchtime? Because you want the day to have moved so fast. You want everybody so engrossed in activity that they don't even notice it went by. And I'm sorry, you may hear some lawn activity in the background. You want our schedule to be flexible so that changes can be made. Your activities are not a trained schedule, okay? You can make changes. Make sure that you've got a system with your classroom staff to say, oh, we got 2 more minutes. And that's an opportunity for somebody to say, I need 3. We're almost done. Could I just have another extra minute? That's a way to check in with your staff to say, let's go a little bit longer. Things are going well. On the other hand, you may have somebody who says, excuse me, can we change soon? Because this is going really badly and I really need to move. And then maybe we speed it up a little bit. Your schedule is not a trained schedule. It doesn't have to be exactly on time. You are allocating time lengths more than, well, it's 10 o'clock. We have to move at this time. So we want to make sure that our schedule is flexible. It changes according to our needs, but we don't want it to be so flexible that there's no structure to it. Because our schedule is flexible, maybe we have somebody who needs a little extra time on an activity, but your students have finished their activity. We need to make sure that we have activities in place for waiting. Now, sometimes that may mean a fidget drawer that you pull out and say, here's some stuff to keep them busy. Here's the real key in setting up your schedule. Downtime is not your friend. And so anything you can do to keep the students engaged in anything is going to benefit you. So for instance, I use what we call table tasks as a waiting activity for times when everybody's not doing the same thing at the same time. Assuming that you're working in a school where most kids don't arrive at the same time, buses come in at different times, carpool comes in at different times. That's a time where we have kids wandering around the room. That's a time where we often have some downtime. That's a time that a lot of our students get in trouble. And imagine having that be the way we start off the day. Instead, when students walk into the room, they walk into a table that looks like this. And so they immediately have hands-on material that they engage with. These are tasks that they can do. The one at the end of the table closest to you in the picture is simply putting those tiles into that coffee can. Very simple task. Some of them are much more complex, building a dinosaur, sorting colored sticks. Some are file folders. Visual motor tasks, they only require one person there to keep the kids engaged, so the other people can be checking the rest of the kids out, getting them, up from the bus. But they immediately come in and have something to engage with. That's something that keeps them engaged to avoid just hanging out and waiting. It may also be that there are times a day our students need to learn to make choices. They also need to learn that sometimes a choice is not available. Like in the picture where you see two people are checked into choice time because we only have 2 computers. So if I wanted computer, I have to make a different choice because the first 2 kids to the choice board got computer today. So that becomes a time that I might do, say, after lunch, where we're going to make choices. They're learning to make a choice, to stick with the choice, to follow through with it, and to accept when a choice is not the option. We have to think about how we're going to group our students together. So we have to think, do they need to be in small groups? Do we put them together by contrasting educational needs? Do we put them together by similar educational needs? Or maybe it's by these kids can work by themselves, or these kids need socialization. So we want to think about how we do this in terms of, do we have a student who has really challenging behavior? He goes in a smaller group because we know we're going to need more hands-on with him than we would be able to provide. Vary the groups to assure that each student is getting what he or she needs. So, if we've got a set of groups in the morning that are set up based on their academic skills, then maybe we set up our activities in the afternoon with their needs for social skills and interaction. So we want to make sure that we're grouping our students together in a way that makes sense. Now, I have to stop right now. Speaking of allotting time at 50 minutes past the hour, I want to thank you for participating in this webinar. To obtain a certificate of completion, you will fill out the form at the certificate of completion link that was indicated on the flyer for this training. Please write down this code as it will be required to receive the certificate. So the code is DCR, so dog, cat, rabbit, 070101. DCR 070101. Dog, cat, rabbit 070101. So now that we've gotten that taken care of, let's go back to grouping. I once had a group of students that I put together because we had 2 students who couldn't stay in their seat. And then we had other kids that were a really nice social skills group together, and they really needed to be talking to each other. They needed to have peers they could interact with. So I put the 2 kids who couldn't stay in their seat in the same group. And I put the kids who needed the social interaction in their group. And by the end of the day, I thought the staff was going to kill me because the kids who couldn't stay in their seat obviously didn't stay in their seat. So you just go get one, you'd bring him back, and the other one would have gone away. And they were like, please, you've got to put these kids in with the other kids. And I said, well, here's why I did this, because the kids that need the social interaction aren't going to get it from these kids that can't stay in their seat. And I said, if I put them in there, it's going to kill their socialization opportunities. And that's what we're targeting with these activities. So we talked and we talked and we talked about it after it was not successful the first day. So remember, I told you, your first day may be good, it may be problematic. That's okay. You can fix it. And so basically what I said is, I really don't want to move them to another group. I really would like to have these groups done by their educational needs. So then we brainstormed ways that we could keep our students who couldn't stay in their seats and maybe slow them down from getting out a little bit. So we blocked off the area with more furniture. We put them in student desks. So there was a desk in front of them that was attached to their chair. So that slowed them down. And we made a ton of what we call put-in tasks, of simple tasks where all you do is put something into a container to keep them busy. And lo and behold, when we did that, we were able to contain them better and teach them to sit in their chairs more effectively the next day. And we're able to keep our social group together, working with each other. So your solution sometimes is to change your groups, but sometimes your solution is to look for other options depending on your educational needs and why you made those decisions. Next, we want to look at sequencing our activities. So we want to put them together so that they will make sense throughout the day. So one of the things that I do is I apply what we know as the pre-MEC principle, which is really the grandma's rule, first then type of activity. So first I do something I like to do. So first I do what you want me to do, then I do something that I like to do. And so I have students that I know I am going to have to schedule them so that we do the things that I need you to do, then you get a break, then we do more things that I need you to do, and then you get kind of a more fun thing. Often I will use my independent work systems as that break time because it's what I think of as I'm in your face making you do hard stuff. Now you get to work on your own, on stuff that you've already mastered. Now I'm in your face again. Some of your kids are going to need that breaking up. Some of your kids are going to be able to tolerate, I do instruction, then I do independent work. But I would generally mix those up for some of our students and do a first then kind of thing. Intersperse your physical activities with sedentary activities. If you are in a classroom where your students can't move around a lot because they need to stay in one place, then let's make sure that we're setting it up so that we're getting up and doing brain breaks and movement breaks regularly during those activities. So it might be rotating among the activities and walking from place to place, or it might be actually scheduling a quick, let's get up and move and dance for a few minutes and then sit back down. You want to embed your sensory activities. You can have a dedicated sensory time, particularly for some of our younger kids. But for a lot of our kids, that sensory input needs to be embedded into the rest of our activities. So we work on math activities where they're engaged in sensory activities while they're doing it. I use materials that are going to have sensory properties for them to count. I use materials that they're going to, we're going to work on vocabulary by step on the picture instead of, point to it sitting at your desk. I like to put my most challenging tasks in the morning when everybody's fresh, because I think it's really hard to try to do those things in the afternoon. That then makes the morning go really fast, and then we have more fun activities that we're embedding skills into in the afternoon. You also always have to check your schedule with your staff availability. I've done many a schedule where it's like, I want 4 independent work areas. And then I find out that's great, but I don't have enough staff for that. I may do a whole schedule where it's like, we're going to have 4 sets of centers, but I only have 3 staff. So if my students aren't independent at independent work, that's not going to work. I'm going to have to change my schedule. Same thing with physical environment. It's always going to go back and forth. So you really want to think about your staff availability as you do this. And we're going to talk about how we schedule staff in a little bit. You also want to check your physical space and resources. I've done many a schedule where I've said, I want 4 independent workstations, but we only have 2 tables. So then I need to make changes. So then you want to put your activities into your schedule. So as you've thought about those kinds of things and you have your activities coming from your tip, I would take a schedule grid and start with the things I cannot change. I cannot change lunchtime. I cannot change when kids go to specials. I cannot change when students are included for a lot of things that make sense. So I put those things on my grid because I'm going to have to schedule around them. They're what Stephen Covey calls in time management, your big rocks. It's a lot easier to schedule your big rocks and then put your little rocks around it. These are your big rocks. They're not maybe the most important times of your day, but they are the things that you cannot change. Then I prioritize the needs by the time and the needs of each student. So again, looking at how I'm going to allocate that time based on the needs of each student, I have to prioritize how that's going to work. And I want to consider using centers where I can do smaller groups to rotate between activities. So rather than doing everything, occasionally I have a classroom where we do a lot of full group activities, but most of the special ed classrooms, I'm going to have small center activities where the students are going to rotate because they're not going to be able to stay with something for a longer period of time. That allows me to give a lot of variety of activities. They get to move between activities and I can build in a lot of skills. This is the schedule template that I use. You can see this one's broken down in 15-minute segments. Sometimes they're broken down in 10-minute segments. Sometimes I break them up in 20 or 30-minute segments. Depends on the needs of your students and how long most of your activities are going to be. So I start with the students whose needs are most demanding. So that kid who needs that, first I do what you want to do, then I get to do something on my own, is the kid I would start with. Usually there's maybe 2-3 students like that. The rest of them may be a little bit more flexible. They're going to be the hardest students to schedule, so I schedule them first. If I have a student who has a lot of inclusion time, I make sure I put that in the schedule. I may have to schedule him early too to make sure I'm getting his work in. If you're teaching a resource class, for instance, where students come to you for specific subjects, then you want to make sure that you schedule those times into your schedule near the beginning of the process, because you need to make sure that they're there for the time you can teach them the skill that they're supposed to get. I want to make sure that every activity on my schedule has clear goals. Lunch is not downtime for our students. Lunch is learning time. But the only way that lunch is instructional time on our schedule and can be counted towards instructional time in the student's program is if we have specific goals that are related to lunch. We have specific goals that are related to recess. And given that most, if not all of our students with autism should have goals related to social skills, interaction, and communication, those are the times we're going to work on those skills. If they're coming to morning meeting in the general ed classroom, what is our goal for them during that time? If they're coming to centers in the regular kindergarten classroom, what is our goal for the student during that time? We need to be very clear about that. And we want to consider, if our student is going out for inclusion, that that's not just a time out of our classroom. How are we supporting his learning goals during that time? Usually sometimes we're going into inclusion for work and academics that the student's able to do, but sometimes we're doing it because our students need the opportunity to interact with peers. How are we supporting that? So this is an example of an elementary classroom with 8 students and 3 staff. This is actually a schedule that I amended to match a changed physical environment based on what I know some districts will have when we come back in the 2020s. Usually in morning meeting, I would be doing it in a group area where all the kids come to that area, but it's possible that we're going to have classrooms. These are students that ordinarily in those centers from 9:20 through 10:20, they would rotate through 3 different areas of the room. In this case, they're going to stay in that area and the teachers are going to rotate. So we have reading, independent work, and story as our rotations in the first rotation. And then they go through that 3 times. Then we're going to do a music and movement time where they're going to get up and move. They're going to listen to some music. We're going to dance around. We're going to do some gross motor imitation. I'm going to embed skills into that, but we're going to get up and move because that's a lot of sitting, especially because they're not getting up and moving. So I'm also going to build into my lesson planning some time where they're going to get up and act out part of the story or do something where they're going to be more movement oriented during our activity, especially at the end of it. Then they're going to go into a rotation with math, games, and writing. So rather than making that another independent work time, I included games because I thought it would be more engaging for them than going back to independent work at their desk. And so the teachers are going to rotate for that. Then they're going to do a choice time while kids go to the bathroom and get ready for lunchtime. Then we're going to do a go noodle break, a movement break where we're doing a video, we're moving around. And again, I'm working on imitation, following a model, video modeling, those kinds of things. Then in the afternoon, I included a social skills time where we're going to work on social skills in small groups, and for some of our students, it might be coping skills for when I get frustrated, independent work, and art. So again, I put my academics in the morning, but my art and my social skills and my independent work all have specific goals that are tied to them. Then they have specials, then they have snack, then we do an afternoon meeting, and then they go home. So this is not that different than the schedule looked. The difference is just that they weren't doing group activities at their desk. And the centers I fiddled with a little bit because I needed them to be a little bit more engaged. This is a high school example with 8 students and 3 staff. And you can see in this situation, we have our students who are doing reading, independent work, computer as their first set of rotations. Then we're doing PE. They come back in and we're doing 4. They were able to do some tasks in independent work, some independent work systems independently. But they still needed support. So I still made it a staffed center. So then we did math, a vocational time, and independent work. So the independent work in the first rotation is academic. The independent work in the second rotation are more vocational tasks. So they're 2 different sets of tasks using the same system. Then they had lunch. You can see that one student went to band and had lunch earlier. So I made sure we got his vocational and math in before he went to lunch. Then they have a leisure time and choice time. I did this partly because our students do need to learn leisure skills. They do need to learn how to make choices. This is also an activity that we can do with fewer staff, which allows me to give the staff breaks for lunch during the day. And when I talk about staff, I'll talk about how important I think that is. Then they had class jobs, so washing down the tables, sweeping the floor, sorting material, getting the teacher's mail, watering the plants, those kinds of things. Then we did art or science, and we switched back and forth. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we might do science. Tuesday and Thursday, we might do art. Then they did a rotation. We actually had 2 portables for this classroom. So then we did a rotation with cooking and games because we had a kitchen to be able to do cooking. So half the kids did cooking while half the kids worked on game playing because again, we're working on leisure skills. We can also build some academic skills into those games. We can build a ton of communication and academics into cooking. Then we get an exercise because learning to be physically fit is a really important skill for our students with disabilities. Then afternoon meeting, and then it was cleanup, and you see choice time as a way to keep them engaged until it was time for them to go to their bus because they all kind of left at slightly different times and we didn't want downtime during that time. Now, there's a link that you can see here, acrlinks.com/schedules. That is a place where you can download a number of examples of other schedules because I can't share all of them during this time. So that's a really good place to go. I've got a number of different kinds of schedules for all different ages. Okay, so coming back to our teaching model, we've got our strong goals, we've got our teaching implementation plan. Now it's time we've made our schedule, we've individualized our instruction through our schedule. Now it's time to think about our organized space. How do we set up our physical environment? So now we really want to think about our builder, my Bob the Builder thing. We've been an architect where we've been planning things out. Now we have to actually put the space together. And you can see this is obviously a before picture. So our goals in organizing our physical activity, or our physical environment rather, are to create an environment with predictability and stability. Don't go changing where everything takes place every day. No one's going to be able to keep track. We want to know that reading's always going to take place in the reading area. Math is always going to take place in the math area. That when I do laundry, I'm going to be near the washing machine. When I am working on making purchases, I'm at the store or the vending machine. So we want to make sure that our activities and our areas make sense for the skills that we're trying to teach. We want to make sure that it's predictable, because if I have to spend all my time worrying about where I'm going to go to do something, then I'm going to be really stressed, and I'm only going to be able to focus on that. And I'm not going to be able to focus on the actual thing I'm supposed to do. The whole point of this whole process is for us to create a system where we can forget about the structure, the student can forget about the structure and focus on the task. And if I'm having to spend all my time worrying about when am I going to do this, or what's next, or where am I going, I'm not going to be able to do that. I want to set up areas of the classroom that are based on the student's needs, as well as, obviously, I'm constrained by my classroom space. Sometimes we have more activities, areas that we can use. Sometimes we have very small classrooms, and we're very limited in what we can do. You know, when we come back at the beginning of the 2020-2021 school year, we may be in a situation where we're much more limited in the students' movement around the room, and that's going to affect it. So again, we may have teachers rotating instead of students. We're going to have to adapt to that. We want to think about developing clearly defined areas. In the best of all possible worlds, I would like to create areas that lend themselves to the activities that we're working on. So morning meeting takes place where I have a whiteboard and a place, enough room for all the students to sit. I may have to make compromises to that coming back in this school year, but when I'm setting something up and thinking about it, if I don't have those constrictions, I want to make sure that I've got enough room for morning meeting. I don't want to put my morning meeting in a teeny tiny place and then have 10 kids there, because that's going to cause behavior, because they're going to be on top of each other. I want to give clear cues to students and staff about expectations. One of the things that came about as I was working on a floor plan for the possibility of coming back after coronavirus and having to separate students out more, is that it's going to take so much space that it didn't make sense for students to rotate through an independent work system. I really like students to rotate through independent work in one area and have direct instruction in another area, because I like it to have different cues. When I'm here, I work on my own and nobody helps me. When I'm here, I do what the teacher says and she can help me when something's hard. I may not have that option. We may need to do independent work at our desk. And at that point, we're going to have to get creative by making sure that we're giving clear cues. So maybe it's, I have my basket system that I set up, and I have a visual that tells me now we're doing independent work. And then I have another visual that tells me now we're doing direct instruction. Similarly, I may be eating at my desk. So maybe I have a placement that I put down that means now it's time for lunch. Now it's not time for eating at your desk when I take it up. And you're always, even in the best possible worlds, going to have areas that are going to overlap. So those visual cues become really important. You also want to make sure that you are setting up your classroom so that you can supervise all the students all the time. You don't want to have really tall dividers that the students are behind, because then you can't observe them. You want to be able to look out over the room and see how everybody's doing as a teacher. That's how you keep track of what instruction's going on. That's how you keep track of the behaviors. That's how you know if a teacher's having, a staff member's having problems with behavior. It's just a good practice for supervising the room. You want to create classroom areas that support the targeted skills for the scheduled activities. So again, if I'm working on independence, I have an independent work system. If I'm working on following teacher directions, I'm sitting where I can see the teacher. So you want to make sure that our areas are supporting our targeted skills. If I have a student who's doing laundry, they need to do that in the laundry area of your classroom if you have a washer and dryer, or the laundry room if they have to go someplace else. You want to have areas that limit distractions and help your students focus on the task at hand. So for instance, when I do independent work, the students are often facing the wall. So they're not looking out over the classroom, seeing everything else that's going on, because that may be very distracting for them. Similarly, you want to think about, if you have multimedia and screens in your classroom, not having them point out to where students see them when they're sitting in a group activity or direct instruction, because then they're going to be distracted by that. I don't know about you, but when I go to a restaurant and there's a television on up in the corner, I have a very hard time. I'm not a particular fan of watching even what's on the television at the restaurant, but I find because it's movement, my eye keeps going to it. And I know that I am distracted from listening to the conversation of the person sitting next to me. So we want to try to avoid those kinds of distractions in our classrooms. And we want to create an environment that increases our engagement and prevents challenging behavior. You can use your physical space to block areas off. I recently got a question asking, what do I do about a student who runs out of the room? We can't block the door because fire code won't let us, but you can put a variety of structured obstacles on the way to the door from where the student usually is. That will slow him down. We know that putting too many students in one small area where they're on top of each other will cause behavior problems. Crowding causes behavior problems. We also know that giving students too much space is going to encourage running. I had a teacher one time who knew that she didn't want open space in her classroom, but she didn't have a lot of furniture. Somehow she found one of those plastic blocks that you put in a playground that had a slide on it. She was constantly pulling students off of that when they weren't supposed to be there, because to them it was like, if you give me playground equipment in the classroom, I'm gonna play like it's the playground. So we want to make sure that our classroom cues are giving clear cues to our students. We also want to make sure that we're using our furniture to give a big enough space so the students aren't crowded, but a small enough space so there's not a lot of open running space. Had another classroom that I walked into a long time ago, and was told, I need a behavior plan for every kid in this room. I was like, well, if we need a behavior plan for every kid in this room, let's start with looking at the room itself. And they had it set up where the centers and the shelves were all against the wall. And then there was a big kidney-shaped table in the middle of the room. And what was happening was there was a student who would run around the kidney table. And when you started to chase him, he'd run the other way. And he could do that all day. But the other thing that he would do is he would jump from the top of the shelves all around the perimeter of the classroom, which would then create all three staff having to go and get him, which then caused all of the other students' behavior to get worse. We rearranged the room was really our first step. And so we moved the kidney table back so that you couldn't go all the way around it. It was up against a wall, so it didn't make a track in the middle of the classroom. We spread the furniture out on the sides of the classroom so that he couldn't jump from one to another, so that he could still climb up on it. But then we set up a procedure for getting him down with less attention because his behavior was clearly attention seeking. By reorganizing the classroom, it was also one of the few classrooms that we had that had way too much space in it. So we actually sectioned off a piece, made it the teacher area, put a divider up to make the area a little bit smaller, so we didn't have as much running room. When we made those changes to the classroom, the students' behavior dropped in general. This particular student that was the one who was kind of setting everything up for the problems, we needed a behavior plan for, because there were some really deeply entrenched behaviors, but we didn't necessarily need a behavior plan for every other kid in the class. We just needed to set it up so that the behavior wasn't being encouraged by its environment. We want to make sure that we're setting up a situation in which we're fostering student independence at navigating the classroom routine. Again, we want the same things to happen in the same place, because if I have to figure out where something is, that's going to take me time in my transition. It's going to likely get me off task, and it's going to increase my anxiety, and it's not going to be predictable. So we want to make sure that if we have students rotating through our centers, that it's in a way that makes sense for them and they know where everything takes place. That takes time at the beginning of the year, but if you keep it consistent and your reading area doesn't become your math area periodically, then your students are going to know, oh, I'm going to reading, I go over here. Oh, I'm going to math, I'm going over here. Oh, I'm doing independent work, there's my independent work system. We also want to make sure that we're creating workspaces that promote engagement in general ed classes. So sometimes general ed classes can be very overwhelming to our students with ASD. So we really want to think about, how do we make this meaningful and work for them. Maybe they need some extra visual cues in that area. Maybe they need a sectioned off space of this is your space where you need to stay, so they can see the boundaries a little bit better. Maybe we need to be clear on where different areas, what different areas are for and where to go at certain times of the day. So we may need to practice that. We may need to create workspaces that promote that engagement. So what type of areas might we have in our classroom? Your areas are going to be determined by your schedule. Your activities on your schedule, each one needs to take place in a place or places. Each type of activity should have a separate or distinct area. Now, again, most of us are not going to have more than one big table. So anything that we're going to do together as a group, like snack and art, are probably going to take place at that table. We can change what it looks like and make it distinct by changing the cues that are at the table. Put down placemats for when we have snack. Put down the art supplies for when we have art. So try to change your cues in different areas so that they can see, oh, now it's art time, now it's snack time. And you want to make sure that each area of the room is functional. If you have an area of your classroom where nothing really happens, that's going to become a congregate area where people go and hang out and get in trouble. So we want to make sure, you know, I told you about that room that was too big that had a track. We sectioned off a section of it because there were sections of it that were not functional for the students. And so by making our space a little bit smaller, it became a little clearer how we were going to use that space. Now, this is the before picture. This is what it looked like in a normal everyday activity. And I'm going to show you the after. You can see that there are set areas that the students are rotating among. And this is the schedule that I showed you, the first one that I showed you for elementary school. Reading, writing, and games will take place in the left-hand corner. Group time will take place with the interactive whiteboard. The students had chairs. They kind of spread out when they got in them, but it looks kind of like a movie theater. There's math and art and snack table. So again, we're going to set it up so that we've got the art materials or placemats and the math materials to show them what we're going to do during that time. So the first rotation of the morning, they're going reading, art, independent work. Then the next one, they're going writing, math, independent work. In the afternoon, they're having games and they're having snack later. So they're having games and independent work, or I forget exactly how it went, but you can see the visuals on the floor. The schedules are over by the door. I sectioned off the teacher area. The computers always have to stay where the computers are because they only plug in one place. So almost every classroom I've ever had, we had to do the whole room arrangement based on where the computers could be. We made sure the monitors were off when kids were working in that center, and we used that center for reading and writing because that had the computers that they could use for that. We had 2 students in each center who really needed less distraction. So their independent work systems are up against the wall, and one could kind of handle being in the middle of the room. In addition, that was also a table that related service providers would come in and provide services sometimes by pulling kids to that table. So it's very structured. You see the use of dividers and shelves to show clear boundaries. The reason for that is that for many of our students, they are not the carpet ends here and now we go to tile. That means I need to stay on the carpet. Some of our students can handle that. Some of our kids need to actually have furniture that shows them a very concrete boundary for where they need to remain. So this gives them that boundary. Now, the other thing to look at are the 2 kidney tables or semi-circle tables. You see that the students are sitting with their back to the wall. Yes, it's possible if I have students that are very distracted, that might be distracting to look out over the room, but really they're only looking at one other kid doing independent work. However, it keeps them from running because I've got them back in that corner. So the table is working as a visual structural cue of stay on this side. Could they crawl under it? Yes, they certainly could, but they're much less likely to do that if they're contained in an area. Now, this is the same furniture assuming that the teacher is not given new furniture, but is being told to keep her kids 6 feet apart. So in this situation, you see with the same furniture, I've got 2 kids in each area, and I still have independent work. So if I had another staff member, I could use my independent work as another area. The kids are going to stay. Those kiddie tables are about 6 feet on each end. That takes up a lot of space for something that's keeping the students at that level. I've divided up the computers because they may not be able to use them. My lineup visuals are not 6 feet apart either. So that becomes an issue because when I went to make them 6 feet apart, they go out the door or out the window, really. So that becomes an issue. So lining up is going to have to be done in small groups if we do that. So this is what it looked like when I used the furniture that we had. This is what it looks like if I really have to keep them at a 6-foot distance, and I have 8 students, because you saw I had a hard time getting 8 students in the other room, and they're going to stay at their desks. If I have student desks, I can set it up so that the white chairs are the staff and then the desks are the students, and each student has all of his materials at his desk, and the adults are going to rotate. But obviously that took up a lot of space. We can still do a group activity with this group by just moving. I might have to move these shelves by moving this divider, and then the students should be able to see the interactive whiteboard from across the room, but that we're going to need to make sure that they've got manipulatives at their desks that they can use to participate, because that's going to be a really critical component. So obviously when we set up our classroom this year, it might be a little different than normal, but we still want to try to have that structure. So let's talk for a minute about materials. We want our materials to engage our students, and we want them to be meaningful, and we want them to be motivating. So we want to use things that are interesting. I have worked with a lot of secondary and adult programs over my time. And sometimes I feel like one of my crusades in life is getting motivating and meaningful materials at the student's age level that is developmentally appropriate for them. One of the things I see when I walk into a lot of secondary programs are a lot of blah materials. They're boring. They're monochrome. For some reason, they're all brown or black. They're not interesting. They're not interesting to look at. And so it's no surprise that our students don't really want to engage in them. We can make colorful, interesting activities for our high school students without having to have counting bears and pop-up toys. We just have to really work at doing that a little bit. And really making materials that are meaningful for them. So again, if we've got students who are doing, we want to make sure that our materials are age appropriate while they're still within their abilities and interests. If we have students in high school who are still working on being able to match things by color, think about the things that you could match that have functional properties. Can they match socks by color? Can they match soda cans when they're recycling or when they're stocking a vending machine by color? Can they match materials for an assembly task by color? We can use age-appropriate materials to work on a younger developmental skill. And there are ways that learning to match colors is functional, or sort by colors is functional, but we do have to have some creativity to do that. So we want to make sure that our materials are age appropriate. Similarly, if I want to work on fine motor skills, I typically don't give preschoolers big metal bolts and screws because that's not really developmentally appropriate. I give them plastic. I give them those plastic bolts and screws that you can find at Lakeshore and many other places. I'm not going to give those same things to the older students. I'm going to look for bigger bolts and bigger screws at the hardware store because I don't want their peers to be walking into their classroom and going, it's a baby class. That's one of the reasons I want it to be age appropriate. Do students have the ability to choose things that are not age appropriate? Of course, we all do. And so I've actually come over the years to start calling it age relevant, age respectful. My job as a teacher to introduce them to new materials that are more in keeping with what their peers are doing. But that doesn't mean that during a time that they're at home, they can't choose to watch Barney. That's their choice. I'm not taking that away from them, but at school, it's my responsibility to introduce things that are more peer age related. You also want to make sure you have a wide variety of materials. Having to use the same materials over and over is really hard. I had a middle schooler once who we set up independent work twice in one day for him. If you are doing independent work twice in one day, make sure you're doing it with different tasks, because we didn't have time to make enough tasks before the first day of school. So when he went the second time, they were the same tasks he'd done in the morning. It would not be ideal. We just didn't have time. So he goes over this, I've already done this. And I know, I just humor us and go ahead and do it again. But I already did this. It's like, I know, but just do it again. And he finally did. I finally convinced him to go ahead and do it. But he did the whole thing going, I've already done this. And you just have to look at him and go, you know, he's not wrong. We're asking him to use the same materials. Yes, he needs to practice those skills multiple times, but not using the same materials. So we want to have a variety, because that's going to increase our engagement. We want to make sure that we're prepared. So we're going to need to make sure we have a sufficient quantity of materials to meet the needs of all the students in our class during any given activity. Now, typically this means that if I want students to share in art, I only have enough paint for them to use them in twos. So they have to share with each other. On the other hand, if I want them to be independent, everybody needs their own paint. In our world coming back in 2020, it may be that every student needs to have his own materials. So it may be that every student has his own calendar to do morning meeting rather than coming up to the whiteboard and doing it that way. We want to check periodically to make sure that all materials are in good repair. Students with autism in particular are sometimes drama kings, and they have what we call catastrophic reactions to trivial things at times. So one little thing goes wrong and it's just like, oh my gosh, it's the end of the world. One of the things is the batteries don't work or something is broken. So periodically check your materials and make sure they work. And then rotate them out. We don't read the same books all year. We rotate our books by season or by month, depending on how often we're changing things out. Same thing with toys for young children. Rotate your toys out. You don't have to have every toy that you have out available for them all the time. Instead, give them a selection of toys and then rotate them out and bring more out so that it's, oh, this is new and fun. That's going to keep them engaged. If I always have the same old stuff, it's not that engaging. We're going to have to think about organizing our materials. So in many cases, you know, in our post-COVID world, we may need to have them have their own materials at their desks. So if you're working with young kids, maybe they have their own puzzles and their own set of blocks at their desk. If we're working with older students, they may have their own, they have their notebooks, but they also may have their own manipulatives at their desks so that they're not sharing materials. We also may need to move their work systems to their desks instead of having a place that they go to do independent work. We can definitely do that. We're just going to have to get creative with it. And we're going to need more materials because we're going to have to put materials with each individual student. Now you can sterilize and change them out a lot of times, but that will take time. So it's not something you're going to want to do in the middle of the day. We're going to, when we store our materials, each student's materials may need to be in their own area. So there's going to need to be a container to contain those materials and a way to organize them so they can access them. You may want to look at making a visual of what the inside of their desk looks like so that the things always go back in the same place so they can find them easily, which is also something I do for a lot of my students that are included so that they are not just, you open the desk and it's like, oh my gosh. If you have a visual that says your notebook goes here, your pens go here, then things are more likely to go back where they need to go. You also want to make sure that we're organizing materials to support the skills that we're targeting. So, and I mentioned this briefly, If students are learning to request, we want to put items out of their reach. If I can reach something, I don't ask for it. Think about it. If you're sitting at the dinner table and you need salt, if it's sitting right in front of you and you can reach out and get it, you're not going to ask somebody to pass it to you. Same thing with our students. Why would I ask you for the Sprite when I can pick up and drink it by myself? On the other hand, if they're learning to work independently, we need to make sure that they can access their materials easily on their own, or they can't be independent. So we want to make sure that we've got that set up. If they're working on social behavior like sharing, we want to arrange it so that everybody doesn't have their own materials. They have to actually share them. It's also important to remember that, and I really like this definition of organization, I really want to be the person who has all the pretty colored binders and everything is color coded, because I love to color code. If I were to move my camera and show you my couch, it looks nothing like my shelf behind me because the camera doesn't point that way. I have not been able to be that color binder person. Some people are, some people aren't. Whether you're a color binder person or not, organization isn't about that. Organization isn't about perfection. It isn't about what looks good on Instagram. It isn't about what I chose to take a picture of versus what I don't choose to take a picture of. It's about efficiency. It's about reducing stress and clutter, saving time, and at home, it's about saving money and improving your overall quality of life. Now, I have learned this late in life that my mother was actually right. It does help to have a place for everything, and everything goes in its place. When you organize things so that things have a specific place, A, your family or your students are more likely to put the things back where they belong. My stepfather used to go so far as to have a place you hung the scissors, and there was an outline of the scissors, and that was where they always went back, and it was a rule. So we never were missing the scissors. Consequently, we didn't go buy new scissors. We didn't have to buy new manipulatives because we've lost them. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about organization. It's not about being pretty or about being perfect. It's about eliminating the clutter so you can find what you need easily. It's about having the materials where you need them, when you need them, and having your students and your staff be able to do that as well. I have a ton more pictures of classrooms, and I actually have video tours of preschool classrooms. If you go to autismclassroomresources.com/classroom-design, that is an index post that has links to all the different classroom pictures that I have. So I don't have time to go through them in a 2-hour webinar, but you can definitely go and get examples there. We also have to think about visual cues, so where our students should be, lining up on the floor. One of the things that's been interesting about coronavirus for me is that suddenly the rest of the world has adopted all of the visual cues, like how far apart do you stand in line? You'll see outside of anywhere where people have to wait, like when they had to vote, there were things on the ground that said 6 feet apart. You know, wait here while that person goes, and then you can come forward. You wanted them to know when work is finished, where to sit, what they need to attend to, what materials belong in different places. If you have a picture that shows this is where it goes, it's much more likely it's going to go back to that place. It may be something as simple as taping off an area of the classroom. This was actually designed for a student who kept pushing his chair back from the table. But I can see it coming in very handy as we have to keep kids in their own areas. We faded this out over time, so don't think that this followed him for the rest of his life. We were able to pull it up in pieces and make a dotted line and then slowly fade it out. But we may put tape on the floor to show our students stay in your space and don't go into somebody else's space. This is a schedule on a cubicle. If your students are not good readers, then a picture schedule is going to make the most sense. For some students like this one, he can read it, but he doesn't always comprehend it. So we added the picture, and we had him sitting at a carol that we got from the library. Whoops. So his schedule was right there. And that allowed him to be able to follow that. It always was in the same place. Keep your schedules in the same place. Some of our students may be notebooks. Having finish signs, stop signs on the door. It's amazing how well this works. If you have students that are obsessed with something in the classroom, sometimes covering it up so that it's out of sight, out of mind works. Sometimes a finish sign just tells them it's not time for that. Are there students who come up and grab that off there and go ahead and use the computer? Yes, they do. For them, I disconnected the mouse, which is a little harder to do these days, but so that then when they tried to use it, they couldn't actually use the computer. But then they learn to pay attention. If it says finished, it's not going to work. So I kind of tricked them that way. And then I think it's really important that we remember that we don't let the visuals stop at our door. We have a tendency to set up special ed classrooms with tons of visuals, schedules, redirection cues, feet on the floor, visuals around the room that show them what's expected, classroom rules. And then the students walk out to go to specials, or the students walk out to go to general ed, and we don't take their visuals with them. Why would that be? The general ed classroom and specials are usually a more complex setting than our self-contained room. So they're going to need the visuals more there than they need them in your room. So if they need just a schedule for when you're changing activities in your classroom, but they can follow a group schedule the rest of the time, they may need a full day schedule or a schedule of every activity when they go into general ed. They need more visuals outside your room, and yet we often don't take them with us. So don't forget to think about your visuals outside of your own classroom. And it's important to recognize that visual cues are for adults too. So the one on the left are actually all of those visual cues, including the quiet sign, are not for the students. The quiet sign is to remind the staff that we only use nonverbal prompts in independent work, and we don't talk to the kids until their work is finished. All of their work is finished, so that they don't get used to, I do something, I look at you, I do something, I look at you to see if I'm doing it right. And then we just wrote in all the kids that were sitting in different places, what their reinforcers were, things like that. The one on the right are just reminders. We're working on responding greetings, initiating greetings, independence in the morning routine, signing in, independence with fasteners. Those are the things that we need to not do for them because we want them to learn them. So don't forget that visual cues are just as important for adults. So coming back to our circle, we've set up an organized space. We've got our schedule set up. Our next step is really, how do we work with the staff? And we use a staff zoning plan to do that. Our zoning plan or our staff schedule makes sure that everybody is supervised, that all the students are accounted for. We know who's responsible for who at what time of day. It also makes sure that all of our materials are set up before the kids get there, so that as soon as they sit down, we're ready to go. You're going to lose the students if they come in from playground or in from recess and have snack, and they come sit at the table, but there's nothing to do. That's when they're going to get up and wander away. So if somebody comes in early and we've zoned that in, they come in early from the playground, they set snack up, when the kids come, boom, we're ready to go. Staff support one another, so we know when somebody has a break, we know that somebody can cover for that because we've scheduled it in. And essentially what we're trying to do is make sure that we have a well-organized room that runs with the minimum amount of discussion, because we don't want to talk about the students in front of the students, and we also don't want to take the time to have to direct the staff, because that takes time away from engaging the students. So see how everything we do goes back to engaging the students. Now, these days, the example I showed you, the floor plan of the elementary class, was using what we call a man-to-man approach, where each of the students stay and the staff, now in this case, in a man-to-man approach, they move with their kids. We may set it up so that the adult moves and the students stay the same, but you can have a combination of what's called a zone, and a zone would be where the teacher stays put, and in this area, everybody who comes into my area, I'm responsible for. And it may be that we have other things that we use, a man-to-man approach, where I stay with this group of kids throughout this set of centers. But there are benefits to putting it in writing. And again, I think that we tend to think that everybody knows what's in our head, just like with the tip. But a lot of times the difficulties that we have with classroom teams of teachers and paraprofessionals, but also teachers and related service providers, are that everybody isn't really clear on what their responsibilities are. The more that everybody's clear on that, the more likely they are to do it. If I don't know what you want me to do, I'm not going to be able to do it. We want to spend less time directing our staff verbally. We want to plan out our training for our paraprofessionals. Remember that page on the tip that had the staff training needs? I know that if I'm going to have the staff do independent work, I need to make sure I've trained them in how to facilitate independent work. So that becomes very important. We want to make sure that we've assured clear directions when there are supervision issues. So when someone says, well, nobody told me that I needed to do that, if you have a zoning plan, you have it in writing that somebody did. So that's an important thing. It makes sure that all the students are supervised. I will guarantee you that the time that a child runs or jumps in a lake or any of the things that we all have nightmares about at night, that will be the time that somebody is going to, that the class staff is going to say, well, I thought you were watching him. Well, I thought you were watching him. Well, I thought you were watching him. Because we haven't delineated who was watching him. Many of our students need supervision. Even our higher functioning students need supervision. And so we need to make sure that we know who is responsible for supervising them. It also helps us for planning our activities and preparing the staff. If they know I'm going to art and there'll be a lesson plan that I follow, they get used to doing that. Just like with our students, don't move your staff around all the time. It gets confusing. And it also allows a substitute to step into the classroom with very little confusion because you have a written schedule of what they need to do. So we all know that when you're not in the classroom, that usually it's paraprofessionals who are stepping in to be able to fill the teacher's shoes because they know the routine, they know the classroom. I have on occasion had subs who did not believe that was the way it should be, and they would argue with the para. It's not the way you want to start off a day when you're already down a staff. So I make a sub-zoning plan. So you can see how I took para 1's line activities and put them in para in the substitute. And I took one of para 2's and put that in the substitute. And then I gave them the teacher's responsibilities. Obviously the sub-plan would not be color-coded. They wouldn't see the earlier one. And they would just come in knowing this is what the teacher does. So this is what I'm expected to do. It's already written, and I've already designated the things that require less knowledge of the students that the paras have that the sub probably doesn't. So that becomes an easy thing for them to pick up without a lot of fuss at the beginning of a day that everybody kind of dreads when you're missing a known staff member. It also means you can create what we call a one-man down plan. A one-man down zoning plan is where you set it up. You've got a regular zoning plan when everybody's there. So let's say we say everybody's there and we have 4 staff. And then a one-man down plan is when one of those staff is absent. So the typical center structure that you see at the top is what it looks like on a normal day. When we're down a staff, we have to regroup and add Larry and Kyle into other groups. Now, I know that I don't put another person with Kelsey and Lane. No, they take all the attention of the person that has them. So Larry and Kyle are going to be better off. Better to have it already set up with a man down schedule and a man down zoning plan. I recognize it is more work up front, but it means that when you're down a man, when you walk into the classroom, you're not struggling to try to figure out all day what everybody's going to be doing. So it makes it so much smoother to do that. The other advantage to one-man down centers is you can run them when you aren't actually one man down so that you have sufficient staff, and that can free you up to provide training and support and supervision for your paraprofessionals. And I would say do that for part of the day once a week for the first few weeks of school to get everybody on board with what they need to do. It also allows you to look at the classroom and see what the students are doing and things you may need to think about for planning. So how do you zone? You task analyze and list the activities and the steps that are needed. So you basically just look at the schedule and you figure out what do we need to have done. We assign each of those activities to a staff member. We establish who is leading each activity. it may make sense, instead of you running every group activity, to have a para run the group activity, and maybe you are better able to support the students and figure out how to fade some of those prompts out that they've been getting for a long time. And I assign children to be facilitated at specific times. And I literally will take the zoning plan and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, that time's done. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, 8 kids in that one. And I will write over when somebody leaves the class for something, so that I won't look around and go, where's Nathaniel? And then go, oh, right, he's a speech. It's okay. I write that on my zoning plan so that then I get used to it. So this is an elementary one. This is a teacher with 2 paras. And this is a very classic zoning plan, this first part of it, because all the kids come in at different times of the day. Their buses arrive at different times. So if you look at that first row, you see that the teacher is staying back. She's setting up table tasks so that when the kids come in, boom, they're ready to go. The 2 aides are going, and Rhonda's going to greet and pick up students and bring them to the room. She helps them do the arrival routine and check their schedule, checks them into breakfast. And when she gets all the kids there, she'll stay at breakfast. In the meantime, Bess is setting up the choice board for breakfast in the lunchroom. They can make a choice when they're finished with breakfast. Then when everybody's done with breakfast in the cafeteria, they're going to come over and we're going to start table tasks, which is our next activity. So that way, Rhonda's, if you're at the bus, Rhonda's got you. If you're in the cafeteria, Bess has got you. Sherry's taking this opportunity to make sure we're set up for the next activity when the kids walk through. Sherry's going to stay with the students, and I've assigned specific students, specific staff to work with specific students to help them during table tasks. Now, in some situations, kids may still be coming in which case I would free up one of those aides to handle buses. One of the other aide to maybe check the kids in, and the teacher stays at table tasks. I made notes about rotating activities, and you can see that Bess is assigned to take data on table tasks each day on one student. So she's tracking a weekly sample of their data. I've designated the teacher is going to run morning meeting and who she's going to prompt, because she can manage this kid and run morning meeting at the same time. Rhonda is going to prompt 2 of the kids and take data on one of those 2 kids she's going to take data on each student in the group once a day. So 1 day a week. So she's going to take data on one of the different kids and get a weekly sample. And then Bess is going to prompt the 2 students who need more support. Here you can see the center rotation, and I won't run through it in a ton of detail because I'm running out of time, but you can find, I'll give you a link where you can find these. You can see who's running, what activities, who they have, what they're doing, what needs to be thought about to follow through. You can also see that I'm very big on scheduling, planning, and lunch times, and here's the reason. If you don't give your staff breaks, they will take mental breaks. We are asking them to be engaged with the students the entire time they're in their room. If we don't have them have time where they can just let their brain go, they will take mental breaks without meaning to, and they won't be planned, and you won't be able to cover for them as easily, and your students will lose that engagement, which will create problem behavior. So you really want to think about that. So here you see where Sherry has lunch and then breaks again. So I cut it down to 2 centers in the afternoon so that I could give the staff their afternoon breaks. This is a middle schooler where you've got a teacher and an aide. So I just wanted to give you an example. If you don't have that many staff, you can do it. You can see where data is being taken with them as well. And then this is the high school schedule that I showed you earlier, where you can see the teacher setting up the individual and group schedules for the day, and the aides are meeting the kids at the cafeteria, and the kids did, after breakfast, they did table washing before they came to class. They came in, teacher ran morning meeting, 1 person assisted with morning meeting. We really only needed 1 aide during that time because these kids were actually able to sit and attend a group activity. So we had the other aides set up the centers and make sure the independent work was set up for the next activities. So again, programming in, being ready to be in to do that next activity as soon as you get there. You can see how they rotate through centers. we've got planning time, we've got lunchtime. This is a good example of a situation in which the aides were staying at lunch for way too long, like hours, and the teacher was very frustrated. But he never really said, I want you to be at lunch at this time. I want you to be at lunch this time. When you come back, you can leave. So they didn't see how it fit in or what was expected of them when they weren't at lunch. So that's a big consideration, is making sure that you've communicated your expectations clearly to the staff. And zoning plans can help to do that. And you can see that I'm pretty detailed in doing them. So with all of this, it's a lot to do. The more that you do at the front of the year, the less difficulty you have later, because the less you're trying to make up for the fact that you got your kids are in bad habits, or your room arrangement wasn't really working, or your schedule was not organized enough. It's not going to be perfect when you set it up, and that's okay. Remember that you don't have to do everything at once at the beginning of the year. So I think it's really important to spend your time on this, even if what you're doing for instruction is more stuff that you know the kids can do, reinforcer assessments. That's a good way to start the year. You don't have to have every single piece of lesson planning done. It would be great, but you don't have to have, your staff needs to know what to do, but run the schedule for the first week or so until everybody gets used to it. Make sure that you've got your schedule running well. Make sure your visual schedules are in place. Make sure, maybe don't start every kid on a visual schedule if they don't know how to use them. Maybe do one at a time. It's better to take consistent small steps forward and build on that and be successful than it is to try to change everything overnight and fail. So I would say start with your tip and make your schedule. You're gonna have to set up your room or it'll be a mess. And then think about your zoning plan. If you can get those things done before the beginning of school, then you can add in more difficult work for the students. You can add in your data collection. You can add in your standards-based instruction. Just create stuff to go during that time to keep your kids engaged. And then gradually you can change over to more instructive kinds of things. So again, that gives you time to get into that routine and make it work for you. I want to thank you for all you do. This is not an easy job, and the fact that you are taking it on is a huge bonus for our students, that you are dedicated enough to learn more about it and to put yourself out there. So I think teachers are amazing. And I know that what we're asking you to do is not an easy task. If you go to acrlinks.com/setupclassroom, you will get my indexing post that has all of my setting up classroom pictures, ideas, schedule samples, all that kind of stuff is there. If you're looking for help on setting up classroom teams, it will also link you to a podcast series on building classroom teams that can help. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, please share them, and I'm sure that we'll be happy to answer them. And then this is just how you reach me, and this should be in your handout as well. Thank you very much.